I've been talking for a long time about our economic system being rigged. And in fact, I wrote the book, How to Make America Utopia, Take Away the Economy from Those Who Rigged It. And the reason I wrote that was because the continuum of a particular economic system that continues to hurt the poor, the middle class, the working class. And, a few years back in 2011, I interviewed Dr. Robert Reich. Everybody remember him as President Clinton's Secretary of Labor. And I remember talking to him and about how this particular system is so poorly designed for the average person, whether it be wages, whether it be healthcare, all these other issues. And that's been 11 years. So I want you to listen to this interview and notice how much stayed the same in 11 years where we should have had some sort of progress. And that brings one to the conclusion that it is not the people, it is not the government, it is the actual result of the economic system that we have. And the only solution, well, we'll talk solutions after this interview. Listen to this, and then we'll take it on the other side.
Welcome to a special edition of Politics Done Right. I'm your host, Egberto Willies, and today we're honored to have Professor Robert Reich, President Clinton's Labor Secretary and author of the most informative book, Aftershock. Aftershock is one of those books that when you pick it up, you don't want to stop reading. I read it while I did my, in the mornings when I do my 90-minute stint on the elliptical. It took me a few days to read it. But suffice it to say, by the time went by so quickly and I was so engrossed in that book that I overstayed my welcome on the machine. I think if you can get a chance to get the book, you probably should. The country is in a bad state. The country is having some serious problems with our economy. And one of the things that we have are people not really understanding the genesis of the problem. And what this book does for you is it actually illustrates in layman's term. Robert Reich is a very well-educated intellect on economics, but he was able to put this book in a fashion that we can all understand. We are honored to have Professor Reich, which was President Clinton's Secretary of Labor between 1993 and 1997. He is now Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the University of California at Berkeley, and he has written 13 books, including The Work of Nations Locked in the Cabinet, Supercapitalism, and of course his current book, Aftershock, which we will discuss in this interview. His marketplace commentaries can be found on public radio at publicradio.com. And he is, one of the most well-respected economists, I would say, on the planet. But anyhow, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing just fine, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you and others. I'm very intrigued about what I've heard about the coffee party.
Right.
And also what you're trying to accomplish. I don't know how best to use our time together, whether you would like me to talk a little bit about the economy and other issues, or whether I could simply answer your questions.
Well, I tell you what, why don't you give me a little stance of our economy first, and then I have some questions that I would really like to answer, but let's go ahead and have you move it on.
All right. I mean, the central problem we face right now is not the long-term budget deficit. That is important. It couldn't be and should not be ignored. But right now, the issue is jobs, wages, and economic growth. And almost all our efforts in terms of public policy and in economic terms, that really refers to monetary policy at the Fed, and also fiscal policy with regard to taxes and spending. Almost all of our policies really do need to be oriented toward growth and jobs and wages. Europe is struggling with exactly the same, in fact, a fiercer form of that tension. Europe is dealing with its debt problems. In my view, it should be dealing with jobs and wages and growth. Because if you don't deal with what is most important, and that's jobs, wages, and growth, your debt problems become even worse. If you don't have a growing economy and people don't have jobs, they're not going to pay taxes. Businesses cannot pay taxes if the economy is not growing, so you have no government revenues. And if you have no government revenues, your debt problem invariably becomes larger and larger. So when President Obama advanced his jobs program last week, it really was critically important in terms of framing the public debate around jobs and growth. I worry a little bit, although I applaud his move this week to ask the rich to pay their fair share with regard to reducing the debt load. I do worry that he will be inadvertently now shifting the frame of public discussion back toward the debt. And most of what we will hear over the next 2 months or 3 months until the super committee, it's called, in Congress reports back, will be how to deal with the debt rather than how to reignite and reboot the economy. And one final point on that particular issue. The economy right now is functioning way below its productive potential, what it could be functioning if we were at or near full employment. Consumers whose spending equals about 70% of the national economy. Consumers are not going to spend because, they'll spend for necessities, but they're not going to spend very much more because they still have a huge debt burden. They still are worried about their wages and their jobs. Their wages are dropping. Their home values are a third less than they were in 2006. And so consumers really are very reluctant to spend, and that's completely understandable. That's rational from the standpoint of consumers. But that also means that businesses are not going to hire more people because they won't hire without customers. And that's a vicious cycle. The only way out of that vicious cycle is for the purchaser of last resort, and that's government, to come to the plate, to actually boost the economy through spending on infrastructure, on education, on what I would like to see, a Works Projects Administration and a new Civilians Conservation Corps for the long-term unemployed, on all sorts of things, including helping states, so states don't have to continue to lay off teachers and firefighters and police officers and social workers and others who are so essential to the middle class and the working class and the poor. The federal government has got to come forward, and even if it means more indebtedness now, it will mean a stronger economy later on.
But Professor,
that's my statement, or at least my unprepared statement. I'm delighted to hear any questions anybody has.
Yeah, I have one specific question firstly, and that is, what is so difficult in our economists remembering 1937, that dip that occurred when we had the exact, or I should say the almost identical behavior that we're currently seeing from the right to bring down the debt at this time?
Well, we don't learn from history, is the simple explanation. 1937, we should have learned, because in 1936 and 1937, Franklin D. Roosevelt did listen to those people, including some of his advisors, who said, well, we've got to cut back government spending. We've got to reduce the money supply because we are coming out of the Great Depression, and we need to worry about the national debt. He did that. The result was we went right back into the Great Depression. We've got to make sure that the economy is healthy before we start raising, before we end the stimulus, before we end fiscal and monetary policies that actually boost the economy. And you're absolutely right, we're on the verge of doing exactly what we did in 1937.
Now, interesting enough, if we take a look, and I did this thing about a lot of people like to use Reagan as an example of cutting taxes and so forth, and he did something that I actually call reverse Keynesian, which was he at the same time that he cut taxes, he actually increased defense spending, and everybody thought they're looking at Reagan today as some sort of a fiscal hero when he was nothing more than a backdoor Keynesian. Couldn't that be said that way?
Well, another way of putting it would be that he used military Keynesian.
There you go.
I mean, that Ronald Reagan and to a certain substantial extent George W. Bush, they spent huge amounts on the military, providing a giant Keynesian demand-side boost to the economy. In the case of Ronald Reagan, it did generate a lot of growth, but it also left the first George Bush and certainly Bill Clinton with a huge deficit. In the case of George W. Bush, it didn't generate very much growth because it came on top of his tax cuts, but also on top of a huge Medicare drug benefit,
right?
Which was mainly, in the way I look at it and the way I look at the numbers, a big bit of corporate welfare for the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
And George W. Bush was also dealing with an economy that was much frailer than Ronald Reagan's economy. But you're right. In either case, in both cases, it was military Keynesianism.
Yes, that is quite interesting. Now, ultimately, what was the trigger for you to write this book, Aftershock?
Well, remember, I wrote this really before the economy was in a so-called recovery.
Right.
And I worried, this was in 2009, I worried at that time that we wouldn't really have much of a recovery because the vast middle class did not have very much of the national income. So much of the national income was still going to the top that the vast middle class wouldn't have enough purchasing power to keep the economy going. And I thought it was important to get that word out. And the notion that inequality, widening inequality, is a major reason we're in the trouble we're in. When so much money goes to the very top, and the middle class, working class, the poor, the rest of us don't have enough purchasing power to keep the economy going, and certainly we can no longer go into deeper debts, you get into exactly the situation we hit in 1928, 29, 30, when there wasn't enough aggregate demand because of widening inequality. So it seemed to me that the argument needed to be made as clearly as I could, and I wish, I wish the administration had paid more attention.
Let me ask you this: you're an economist. There are thousands of economists here in town or in the country. They are bound to know this. Absent politics, why is it that we cannot get this message out? I mean, it's not rocket science per se. Why do you think? What do you think is a hindrance to getting this message out?
Well, one of the problems is that economists generally don't like to talk about inequality because they feel that they have nothing to say, that it's not part of their profession. They deal with efficiency, they deal with growth, but they don't really deal with distributional issues. Secondly, most policy people are reluctant to talk about it because they also are worried about the politics. The minute in this country anybody talks about reducing inequality, they're accused of being a socialist or worse. A lot of politicians are reluctant to talk about widening inequality for the same reasons, or because their campaign donations, so much of them come from the very wealthiest people in our society or big corporations and Wall Street. They are reluctant to even mention widening inequality. But we're getting to the point where the people at the top are taking home so much of the national income and so much of the national wealth, and we have a huge, devastating ongoing recession. It's not really a recovery for most people. And plus, we've got to bring down the long-term debt. So under these circumstances, you can't avoid talking about all this.
Now, when you called your book Aftershock, the first thing I did when I bought the book is I said Aftershock. The reason it's kind of scary is because after an earthquake and you have aftershocks, you don't have one, you have several. So I was wondering if you were implying that we were going to be getting a whole lot of dips before we reach a new normal, if you will.
Well, we're already experiencing economic shock after shock. A lot of people thought last spring, that we were coming out of the recession, and then we had a little bit of an upturn in the first part of this year, and then we experienced another aftershock, which is the decline in consumer confidence, another decline in home values, and I expect that this will continue for a while. I mean, we're not going to get out of this, even if we have an adequate boost from the government in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, because there's no capacity in the middle class and the working class and the poor to keep the economy going. And when I talk about purchasing power, I'm not just talking about buying stuff, material goods that's not sustainable either. No, I'm talking about the ability of the middle class, working class, and the poor in this country to lead a good life, and that entails a lot of non-material goods, good health care, good environment, high quality education, child care, elder care, all of the things that people want and need in order to have a higher standard of living. Most people these days simply can't afford it.
I mean, you brought up something that's interesting. I hadn't planned on asking this one, but it's you mentioned in effect the real estate and housing. Given the bubble and the fraud that we had in real estate that flooded the market with all these homes, how long before we get out of this dilemma, if you will, or should we just have the prices normalized all at once?
Well, it's going to be a while, particularly if the government does nothing. I mean, I think when we bailed out Wall Street, one of the conditions we should have put on the Wall Street bailout was that Wall Street modify all of these loans that struggling homeowners can't possibly deal with. But we never demanded that Wall Street do that as a condition for getting a bailout. And as a result, we have now nearly a quarter of all homeowners who are underwater, who owe more on their homes than their homes are worth. And many of them are struggling to pay their mortgage bills because they have their jobs have disappeared, their wages are going down, they have medical bills. And the administration, unfortunately, has not come up with a solid way of reducing this burden. I would say there are two ways of doing it. Number one, simply amend the bankruptcy laws to allow people to declare bankruptcy, personal bankruptcy, and include their primary residence. The bankruptcy laws do allow someone to declare personal bankruptcy and include second homes or include commercial property, but they don't allow primary residencies. If you made that small change, it's not that everybody would declare bankruptcy. It's that you would give people more bargaining leverage with lenders, with mortgage lenders, to reorganize the terms of the loan. The second thing that could easily be done is for the Federal Housing Administration to buy up shares in people's homes. That is, if I have a $100,000 mortgage and I can't meet the payments, the FHA comes in and says, well, we'll take $50,000 of that mortgage as long as we get a corresponding share of the upside gains when you resell the house, and the house is eventually going to go up in value. That debt for equity swap would also help people a great deal.
That is intriguing because when we speak about people being underwater and for the responsible ones that decide to continue paying on this asset, isn't that really just a transfer of, implicitly a transfer of wealth?
Of course it is.
You know, and the question then is, whereas companies, corporations can file for bankruptcies under any scenario, we have the average American citizen that can't.
And again, debt equity swaps are done all over the place. I mean,
Right.
we're not giving people handouts, but if somebody can't meet their mortgage payment, it seems to me entirely reasonable for the federal government to take over part of that cost as long as the federal government and taxpayers get the upside gains. The same thing would be with student loans that can't be repaid, right? Rather than have all of these huge student loan debts, the federal government ought to say, well, now wait a minute, we will do a debt equity swap. We will say to you as a student or as a family with a student who has big loans, we'll take over part of that loan as long as for the student, the first 10 years of full-time employment, the student pays, say, 10% of earnings back to the federal government. That would be kind of an equity stake, in other words, in the student's future earnings.
I mean, you articulated that very well in the latter part of your book under The Bargain Restored. In fact, that was something I was going to ask about later on, but you brought that up. I actually love that idea because it actually encourages students into low-wage professions that are very necessary, teachers and these other professions that, you know, a lot of people would just look at now and say, well, I can't make a living on that. So I actually love that concept. Now, you have, the first part of your book was called what do you consider that was considered broken bargain? And my question to you is, what do you consider then the broken bargain?
Well, the old bargain, certainly between 1946 and 1975, it wasn't an explicit bargain, but we all understood it, was people ought to be paid enough money in this for their work, for their labors, to be able to turn around and buy enough to maintain a decent middle-class living standard. Or another way of putting that is that as productivity rose, everybody should gain higher wages in proportion. That was the rule. That's what we did do in those 3 decades. As productivity gained, as the economy grew, everybody shared in those gains. And that was the basic bargain. It worked very well for the economy because it gave people enough money so that they could turn around and buy what the economy was capable of producing. Beginning in the late 1970s, and then with a vengeance through the 80s, 90s, and up to the present day, we've reversed that bargain. We've turned our backs on that bargain. Productivity continues to rise. The economy continues to grow. But average working people no longer are earning, if they have jobs, nearly as much in proportion to the size of the economy. They actually, many people, many male workers, for example, are earning less than they did 30 years ago, adjusted for inflation. If you're a wage earner, that is, you're paid by hourly wages, you are almost certainly paid less today than you were paid 3 decades ago, adjusted for inflation. Again, by breaking that basic bargain, we are shooting ourselves in the feet because we find we have this crisis of aggregate demand. The average people, average working person, if you add up all the average working people together, the great middle class, working class, poor of America, there's not enough purchasing power to keep the economy going.
Right. Now, I have a touchy subject here that I'd like to ask you about because I still don't have a good grasp of it, and that is NAFTA. Where do you think NAFTA plays in our, and I mean in its entirety now, in our outsourcing issue?
Well, I don't think that now the North American Free Trade Act was oversold, in my opinion, but also the people who feared that all manufacturing jobs would go to Mexico, their fears were overblown as well. Manufacturing jobs didn't go to Mexico, they went to China. They had nothing to do with NAFTA. North American Free Trade Act actually is not a major cause of our problems today.
Now, how do you express the problems in China? Why is our manufacturing going over to China as opposed to, let's say, using the NAFTA domain, if you will? It's actually now leaving China. China is losing manufacturing jobs,
both because China is loading up its factories with technology that replaces people, but also because Chinese labor is becoming a little bit too expensive. And so companies are relocating in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in all over Southeast Asia. The other point is that China is assembling components that are made all over the world, including made in the United States. So to say that China is now the center of manufacturing now, I think actually simplifies too much.
Okay, now what do you think will then be required for us to actually become manufacturers again?
I don't think that's, there are a lot of things that we will continue to produce, but the manufacturing process, if you look in any modern factory today, in the United States or even in Europe, is now mostly done by robotics, by numerically controlled machine tools.
Yeah.
It's not labor intensive. The old assembly line is disappearing. You've got technicians sitting behind computer consoles who are connected up with the robotics and the numerically controlled machine tools, but you don't have large numbers of people doing manufacturing work. That's a mythology. Manufacturing is not going to generate a lot of jobs, even if we got it back.
Oh, okay. That's something that I learned. I didn't quite know that. So where do you think our employment picture needs to come from?
Well, there are two separate questions, where it will come from and where it needs to come from.
Okay.
Jobs, if you look at 2006 and 2007, just before the Great Recession, we had about a 5% unemployment rate. The problem was that most of those new jobs we were creating in the early part of this decade, or the last decade, were in retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital, surface transportation, child care, elder care. In other words, they were low-wage jobs. And those jobs, while many of them are important jobs, and many of them are the people are certainly worth respect. I'm not denigrating them. They don't pay very much, those sorts of jobs. And if you look at the jobs that have been created since the trough of the Great Recession, you see that most of those jobs also are in the local service sector. So when jobs start coming back, as they have started to come back, they're not good jobs. Our biggest long-term problem with regard to jobs isn't the number of jobs. We'll certainly have, once demand returns, we'll have the right number. The real problem is the quality of the jobs.
And how do we get there?
Well, the real question is, how do we get higher quality jobs back? And it seems to me there are only two answers there. One is we invest better in education for the long term, and I'm talking about early childhood education as well as better and more effective higher quality K through 12 and better access to higher education, including community colleges. But also we have stronger unions because stronger unions give people, whether they have had higher education or not, stronger unions give them more bargaining leverage in terms of getting a portion of the gains from growth and productivity growth in particular. Stronger unions, it seems to me, are absolutely essential to give the middle class, working class, and the poor greater access to a greater share of the gains from economic growth.
Excellent. Let me bring in, there's Bruce had a question for you. So Bruce, could you go ahead?
Hi. Yeah, sure. So my name is Bruce McGue. Professor Reich, it's nice to talk to you.
Hi, Bruce.
So I enjoyed reading your book, and I'm quite interested in the policy prescriptions you offered, and in particular, the first two, at least by my read, were on the reverse income tax and your reemployment initiative. And the reason I'm interested in these is because they both signal income redistribution, which you use a term already. It's sort of equated to socialism, and then as we've learned in the media, socialism is thought of as anti-American. And so my question for you is, how would we, as a citizenry, have the politicians implement policies that are consistent with this kind of income redistribution?
Well, first of all, Bruce, I don't think it's fair to call them income redistribution, because it's not a zero-sum game in which the rich have to lose in order for everybody else to gain ground. If you were a rich person, a very wealthy member of the super rich of America right now, you would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy than you will do with a big share, such as you have right now, of an economy that's almost dead in the water. It's in your interest to make sure that people are well educated, that we have good infrastructure, that the economy is growing again, because you'll do much, much better. It's not a redistribution in that sense. And I think it's very important to answer the critics who say this is redistribution with an understanding that the dynamic economy works for everyone. We saw this in the first 3 decades after the Second World War, when a rapidly growing economy made a very, very large number of people very wealthy, but it also made everybody else wealthy at the same time. The second point, Bruce, is that in terms of, for example, raising taxes on the wealthy, the polls are overwhelming in showing that Americans feel that the rich should bear a fair share of the sacrifices that are necessary to bring the long-term budget deficit down. The president's laying down the gauntlet yesterday and saying that he's not going to sign any bill that comes out of the super committee that does not, if it attacks Medicare, he's not going to sign any bill that does not raise taxes on the wealthy, was met by widespread approval, and also again, not just the polls but all the focus groups, everybody around the country. So I say that only to underscore that when income inequality becomes as out of whack as it is now, a lot of the public is not adverse to taxing the wealthy.
Okay, well, that seems fair, but then how do you explain the power it seems that political segments like the Tea Party have when they're advocating against raising taxes on the rich? They seem to have a very strong hold on our politicians.
Well, I think that one reason is because the Tea Party is in part being subsidized by the Koch brothers, Karl Rove, Dick Armey. A lot of money is going into what looks and appears to be a grassroots movement, but if you look very closely, is very well financed by some very, very wealthy people who want to pull the wool over a lot of average people's eyes and convince them that it's in their interest not to tax the wealthy. I think the other point is that many people in America have bought into the mythology of trickle-down economics, that if you reduce taxes on the wealthy, you will create more jobs and better wages. Well, you have only to look at history and see that mythology is a cruel joke. Nothing trickled down. I mean, Ronald Reagan reduced taxes on the wealthy, and middle-income people's wages stopped growing. George W. Bush reduced taxes mostly on the wealthy, and the median wage started to actually drop. I mean, there is no trickle-down economics, and I think that a lot of people who might be supporters of the notion of trickle-down economics need to be better educated about what actually has occurred.
I think it's willful ignorance.
Well, I don't know how willful it is or what's going on, but I think it's all of our responsibilities
yes.
to get the truth out.
Now, I have one more person that would like to get in, and that is Bob Weil. Bob, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Go ahead, Bob.
Hey, Bob. I don't think we've really touched base since probably we might have seen each other occasionally at Dartmouth, but you interviewed me to get into Dartmouth, so that I give you points for because it was one of my more fun times.
Oh, but, good. I was worried that you were going to say it was a terrible experience.
No, I probably did not take full advantage of the academic opportunities, though. But my biggest concern is that right now we seem to be concentrating on jobs and getting an economic recovery, but it seems to me that the real strengths of free enterprise and capitalism have been seriously compromised on for quite a while, whether it be derivatives, which basically have turned the concept of people investing into companies that they really believe in long-term into speculating or gambling on what a stock's going to do short-term, or Wall Street bashing companies for having a long-term vision, like putting emphasis or equal emphasis on employees versus their investors, and rewarding productivity. They seem to prefer to see layoffs and outsourcing, and don't mind seeing huge amounts of golden parachutes. Or for another, I know I'm kind of going on, but advertising and marketing seem to have trumped quality, goodwill, and word of mouth in terms of how the whole free market should make the cream rise to the top, right? And so I'm kind of asking, how do we reward productivity and adding social value versus rewarding whoever's best at gaming the system?
Professor? That's a big question. A lot of it has to do with finance. The biggest games in the system correspond with the rise of financial capitalism as opposed to product capitalism, and that occurred starting in the 1980s with all of the takeovers and the leveraged buyouts, and has continued right up until the implosion of Wall Street and beyond. We had a great opportunity to reinstitute what's known as the Glass-Steagall Act. Unfortunately, the Clinton administration was responsible in part for getting rid of that, but that separated commercial from investment banking, and that reduced a lot of the gamesmanship that you are talking about. Not all of it, but it did reduce it. And unfortunately, when the opportunity came to reinstitute it, we didn't. We came short of that. The regulatory financial reform measures we've passed so far have still very, very big loopholes large enough for financial investment bankers and hedge fund managers to drive their Ferraris through. Exactly. I think it is a huge problem, but I think we've got to work very, very hard for sane separation of investment and commercial banking, and thereby sane financial reforms.
Professor, thank you very much.
I want to thank you all for your time and your interest.
And I hope to see you at the Take Back American Dream.
Great.
You have a good day now.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Robert Reich, Dr. Robert Reich. But the sad part about it is the more things change, the more they stayed the same. As I mentioned in the beginning of this particular issue, this interview, it is not the government, it's not our people. It is a flawed design of our economic system that lends itself to what we see in occurring in our economy, an economy that hurts most. When people are doing well, they're really not doing well. They're living on credit. They're living from paycheck to paycheck. Most of Americans are never, ever doing well. They may be a bit comfortable, but they're never doing well as hard as they work. What we need, as we've spoken about many times, as I've mentioned in the book, How to Make America Utopia, take away the economy from those who rigged it. What we need is not reform, but a revamping of the stakeholders in what makes an economic system. And that needs to start sooner than later. And the only way for that to occur is for us to ensure that we vote in primaries. And in the primaries, we elect progressive people who believe in moving us into an economy that serves us all. And then in the election, the actual major election, you elect those progressives that you elected out of the primaries. There's no shortcut. To change this economy, we have to change people. And the people we have to elect have to be people who are not bound to the moneyed interest, but who are ready to serve you. We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.